It's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on evaluating social innovation prototypes. I'd like to start by centering where we are. Please feel free to acknowledge the traditional territory that you're on right now. Excuse the background noise. As a community, we're gathering from many individual spaces across Turtle Island. Where I am, I'm acknowledging the land that I'm meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I'm centered in Toronto today. And that these lands are now home to many diverse First Nations and Inuit and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by the Treaty 13 of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'm really excited for today's webinar, and we have an engaging discussion on prototype effectiveness and explore ways to strengthen our lab practices that contribute to transformative change. For us at SI Canada, applying innovative approaches to challenges of national relevance is one of our key areas of work, and the prototyping process is a major part of this. I've learned so much from our speakers that you're going to be able to hear from today. And I'm going to start by introducing you to Geraldine Cahill, the Director of Engagement at SI Canada, who will be moderating the discussion for us. Geraldine.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Thanks so much for that introduction, and welcome everyone. It's exciting to have us all join in this conversation today, and it's not a surprise to me that so many are interested in getting into the whys and hows of prototyping and evaluating them. And part of that, I think, is I know he won't think this himself, but the guy that we're going to introduce first, Mark Cabaj, who for many of us needs no introduction, is a big draw for this community, and I'm excited to welcome him here today. He's the author of the report evaluating social innovation prototypes and a leading evaluation expert. And he is also the president of Here to There Consulting. He'll share some thoughts first on the substance of the report or the guide that was generated. And then we'll be joined by Ben Weinlich, who's the executive director at Skill Society and founder of Think Jar Collective and also Action Lab. And then also Aliyah Velji, senior specialist, innovation and research at the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And CMHC itself has funded and participated in at least 66 solutions labs in its role with the National Housing Strategy. And I know Aliyah has deep experience to share both with the CMHC and also in her previous roles as well. So this is an awesome group of folks to bring together today to share their lessons or their insights on prototyping and evaluating their effectiveness. I was thinking over the weekend about my first experience of prototyping, and actually the thing I thought of yesterday was when I was trying or thinking I could be an actor. You know, I was thinking of the process of rehearsing, and you know, you're trying lots of things out, giving things a go, working in a collaborative space to work on a performance, and you gather feedback along the way. It's kind of a risk-free, generous, rapid process of continual experimentation and adjustment. And there's an evaluator there for you in a way. There's a director or a coach helping track the experiments and guide the changes. And if you're really lucky, you get you know, multiple kicks at the can before that version moves forward. I'm not sure it's exactly the same. I recognize there's some tensions there. You know, you don't want to do a whole bunch of rehearsing and then not go ahead. But it was reminding me a little bit about the elements of the rehearsal process. In terms of the work more closely related to today in social innovation, I think my next foray really was a 2-day workshop on understanding how a change lab works that was facilitated by Rios Partners, Anna Kahane and Joe McCarran probably around 2011 or so. And during that session, we were given a whole bunch of leaves and sticks and rocks and such to try and create something that could make real these conversations we were having around what kind of solution could we work on together. Sort of 200 people divided into working groups to work on a tricky problem in a workshop. And that, of course, was even more divorced from prototyping that we do that feels that is more in the real time aspect of life. That was a learning experience. And since that time, I've been lucky enough to grow, through more prototyping and lab style processes. So I'm really excited to hear from our folks today. In evaluating social innovation prototypes, the guide, Mark offers the following definition for prototyping. It's an act of making an idea of a product, tool, or process visual and tangible, and then testing and improving it further before deciding if it warrants a more formal and sophisticated design and test, or even a full-fledged adoption as a solution. At Social Innovation Canada, we're dedicated to offering up resources on what works when it comes to social innovation processes that can support your social change efforts. And prototyping, whether applying it in the process of a lab or in social R&D processes or other project arenas, it's a hugely valuable process to hone. The role of evaluating the testing period is vital for all sorts of reasons, and that's why we're so fortunate to have Mark offer us his reflections on this process. The guide was first published about 18 months ago, and now it's republished with its own adjustments, if you like, refining process itself. We're going to turn to Mark first to talk over the report and some of its key elements. Mark, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Geraldine. What an excellent introduction with excellent sort of accessible metaphors about what prototyping is. Thank you and to Andrea and Kathleen for hosting and organizing the call. Thanks to Social Innovation Canada for making this all possible, this guide. Thanks to the 30+ people who contributed to the work. And thank you to Ben and Aaliyah, veteran change makers, social innovation prototype veterans, to provide their additional commentary and insight on this topic. Hello, everyone online. Thank you to you as well for coming. I'm in Edmonton and Treaty 6 country today, and happy to join you on this topic. Geraldine, we talked about this. I think I'm going to chat for about 10 or 12 minutes, and then we'll open it up for further discussion. And so I will give just some high-level thoughts about the intent of the guide, how it was developed, a little bit about the changes that were made from version 1 to version 2 and why. Number 3, a taste of some of the elements in the guide, so people have a rough sense of what they're getting into if they open it up. And number 4, the part that in some ways makes me most excited, all the things that the guide doesn't do but still needs doing in this field. As you'll hear through the discussion today, it's a good contribution, I think, a solid contribution, but it's clearly only a small contribution to something that we need to get much better at, and that's evaluating our big ideas about how to make the world better. So perhaps I will jump to the first slide and talk just a little bit about the intent. And this started during COVID, believe it or not. And like most of you, I don't remember much of what happened in that 2 or 3 year period. But one of the opportunities was presented in that time was to reflect a little bit while we were sitting in our homes and start doing some honing of skills and ideas in social innovation and change, hoping to make a sense of this disruption and make a better world at the end of it. And prototyping and social innovation is part of that discussion. And the idea was could we talk a little bit more about how to be more systematic and intentional about evaluating social innovation prototypes, because we have been using that term for quite some time, ever since, I think, Geraldine, you're right, like in the 28s and 10s, the social innovation field really began to grab onto this idea. And I will admit that I didn't want to do it, partly because I knew doing this stuff is hard. This is a big idea that everyone sort of feels warm about, but when you get into the work itself, it's pretty messy and it's hard to make clear and accessible, and it's really hard to get people on the same page about. And then I realized that was the very reason I should do it, because I myself have been highly improvisational in this field, and not that improvisation is bad, as the guide is one of the principles in the guide is that you're going to have to improvise no matter what. But I think there is value in trying to be more intentional and systematic about everything we do. And so when we talk about the content of this guide, which we'll do shortly, I want to confirm that the content isn't meant to be the framework. It's meant to be a framework that is very useful in a way to evoke a response in people to say, does this work for you? What would you adjust and change, and why? And I myself have used this guide in 3 different social innovation projects recently, and it's changed every time. Some group wanted a much more assertive and direct inclusion of equitable evaluation principles, which I find useful. If you've not seen the Equitable Evaluation Initiative, you should take a look at that. Another group had another angle that emphasized more some climate change content and context. And another group that's working with domestic and sexual violence had their own curl on it. So the guide was a very good start, and all frameworks need to be adapted to their context in a way that reflects whatever is unique going on in that situation and what's important to the change makers. So with that intent in mind, Social Innovation Canada sponsored this through a collection of resources by the Government of Canada, the McConnell Foundation, and Suncor Energy Foundation. Oh, we'll go back one, sorry. And maybe there, yeah. And it was informed by, there's a lot of smattering of good resources out there, and a lot of this is in the table of, not the table of contents, but in the resource section in the back. And we had 30 different people contributing from time to time, both in terms of scoping, providing examples, stress testing early versions of it, etc., in varying degrees. So there's a lot of hands and pens on this idea. However, I'm the one who synthesized it all. And so if you like it, you thank all those people who made good input. And if you don't like it, you can say, Mark, you should have done a better job, and here's how you would have done it. But the emphasis is, here's what I think it does. It provides something to react to and to adapt. And it does say, can we be more intentional and systematic about this? Because Geraldine, the only thing I'm glad you used that example of the rehearsal. Not everything that is rehearsed should go to showtime. In fact, I don't know if Sarah's on here or Ms. Schulman, but she shares an example of, it took something like 5,200 prototypes for the, what's that famous vacuum cleaner? The Dyson vacuum cleaner. Yeah, thank you. To get to that framework. And so in the social innovation field, we cannot do 5,200 rehearsals or trying out different ideas to make change, but neither is it one-to-one. Right? And how do we determine if something should be developed more fulsomely? We're developing and testing a prototype to understand whether we should bet bigger. A prototype is a small bet before a big bet. Sometimes that small bet immediately tells us, hey, swing for the fence. This is an awesome idea. Don't get all neurotic and testy. This is worth it. We've tested it, and we feel that given the situation and given the feedback, let's roll this out. In other cases, we might want to be more cautious. Now, that's a case-by-case call. So that's the intent, to be more intentional and systematic, with the content being kind of like an opening move. Maybe we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So the guide itself, the version that was developed in the summer 2022, had some foundational ideas about prototyping and what prototypes were and were not. The purpose of prototyping, which I want to talk about right away, and there's multiple different purposes, but the primary purpose is to test your small bet to help you determine whether or not you want to make a big bet. It has some exploration of test criteria with some examples of what good might be in a prototype, with the understanding that everyone has to decide what good is in their context and be explicit about it. There's no standard of good. It does talk about principles. We've developed just short of a dozen principles to guide thinking and action, and I want to talk about those shortly. A number of different steps and a whole variety of aids and tools. Now, we had thrown that out 18 months ago, you're right, Geraldine, and then already we started getting feedback, direct and indirect. I was just I put a Google search on just to see how people reacted to the guide. And, you know, as per usual, some people liked it. Some people adopted it hook, line, and sinker, hook, line, and sinker. And other people said, oh, I wish you wouldn't have done that, including someone who said that was an unfortunate use of the nest to swirl, which many of us are familiar with. And so made an adaptation there that's described in the guide, clarification of what was in and out of the guide. And of course, there's a whole bunch of little items to address with any upgrade, and we did that. Now, version 1.1 is a good title because I know we don't have the bandwidth for this, but I do think we need 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and 2.0. But it needs to be continually adapted to reflect new learnings and new feedback. So let's maybe go to the next slide and give you a taste of the kinds of things that are in there that might warrant upgrades from the perspective of everyone on the call. Actually, one slide that's not on here, I just mentioned to the team as we got on that I wish we would have got on. One slide confirms that when push comes to shove and we're asked to evaluate prototypes, when you're writing a guide, it's very good to come to the conclusion that we should not be talking about what is the impact of that prototype. And why do we say that? Everyone, when you say evaluation, thinks impact and thinks measurement. The purpose of a prototype is a small bet before a big bet. The purpose of evaluation is to learn about the value of the bet. And the prototype is often not meant to be live. It's meant to be being rehearsed, as you meant, Geraldine. It doesn't mean you can't observe it and have opinions about it and anticipate what the impacts might be. And it doesn't mean that the process of prototyping doesn't have impacts on those who are involved in the act of creating something new and getting their head around the complex problem, how to address it. I've changed in every prototyping process I've ever been in. I can feel it in my bones. And it doesn't mean the very act of engaging with people and testing the prototype, i.e. we've got a new housing model, I know you were talking about that earlier, doesn't affect the people on the receiving end who are exposed to new ideas. So there are effects, they're called process effects. We'll talk about that shortly, but it's not a pilot, it's not a demonstration, it's pre-pilot and demonstration. So number one, it's very good to say that. And so there's a lot of problems and technical issues in prototyping. We should not get distracted by, does this prototype have a conventional understanding of impact? It's not supposed to. It doesn't diminish its role. It says that's what we're trying to find out, whether we should go to that place where we should even explore that question more fulsomely. A couple other things that are worth pointing out that provide a taste of the guide. It confirms that when you're doing evaluation of prototypes, that over time, as you make a bigger bet from left to right on this diagram, the burden of evidence goes up, right? From a low fidelity prototype, I know Ben's got thoughts on low fidelity prototypes to all the way to a pilot demonstration, more evidence required on the right-hand side. And if you're dealing with a high stakes solution, the burden of evidence goes up. And the reason we say that is because we don't have to do a randomized control trial for every prototype. We need to manage the boundaries of what's the appropriate level of proof. So we explore that a little bit. It's clumsy, but it makes the point. You'll see some principles here. There's 12 of them. Wasn't trying to be biblical. It just ended up with 12. Crazy little principles. Someone said 14, there's 9. I don't know how we ended up with 12. But I like principles because Michael Quinn Patton is the person who introduced us to how to use principles in evaluation. And principles are not recipes. Recipes tell you what to do specifically and how to do it, in what proportions and what steps. Principles say, pay attention to this and use your judgment about how to apply that in your context. So, for example, number 10, counter your biases. I just heard a story of Zaid Hassan from Rio's Partners, who actually wrote the book Social Labs Revolution, who tells a story of doing those little paper towers at the beginning to introduce prototyping. Have you ever done that, everyone? I can see some nodding, Andrea and Geraldine. You build the towers to see who's higher, and it's supposed to show improvisation and teamwork. And they come and they hit the towers and they all fall down. And people got really angry and they said, you spent 10 minutes on this tower and you see how much you love it already? Right? And how unwilling you are to let go of it. Imagine this in prototyping. So this tries to take some of these principles to make things explicit, focused on real learning, not theater. Start small with your testing and then evolve over time. Promote social justice. Other people would prefer equity, diversity, inclusion. That could equally fit that principle. We just happen to use that one. Embrace the idea of bricolage, that there's no right method or metrics, that you have to combine unique methods and techniques by case by case, etc. So those seem to be directionally correct, even though there could be more and they could be reframed. We talked a little bit about phases in this guide, and we also talk about methods. And the reason we talk about indicators, not methods, is because all social innovation is driven by questions. Social innovation evaluation driven by questions. And what we need is a big toolkit of methods that are diverse and inclusive to be able to try and answer those questions. So we focused a little bit on opening the menu of options to all the different ways you could gather and get data to test your promising ideas. So Geraldine, this was just, we talked a little bit about a taste. There's a taste of some of the things in there, and I do feel they were the right things to talk about, but we know that people might want to talk about them in different ways. So let's talk a little bit as the tail end of this about the things that we might add. And listen, as a person who had to finish this with the pen in their hand, I felt pretty deeply all the things that we missed in this guide. And it's very frustrating to have to close something off, knowing that there's so much more to talk about. So here are other things that we should continue to talk about. And those on the call, if you've got the energy, start writing, start framing. There's lots of work to do in this field. So the last slide will give us a taste of that. So this is my summary of the work. So when writing the guide and the upgrade, it occurred to me, and I think this is where I approached SI Canada and said, I really want to put this in, realized that this guide profoundly reflects a design orientation to social innovation prototyping. Strong framing, highly facilitated development, design thinking, etc. And Ben, you're on the call. I'm from that world. We're from that world. There's Aaliyah's a design-oriented person, and Social Innovation Canada. We all know this, but we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of prototypes that emerge in a more emergent organic process. And Frances Wesley, actually one of the co-authors of Getting to Maybe, she challenged me on this in one of the workshops that I was in, and she challenged me hard. And I've realized that I have never really properly responded to that in terms of my writing and my own work in a written way. A lot of stuff is just the way people get stuff done. I'm prototyping. I don't need it to be a design orientation. I'm just winging it. Like I'm improvising and I'm being serious about it. And so this is heavy planning design orientation. It doesn't capture the more or emergent organic approach. And I think that deserves attention, and it doesn't do it in this guide. This is clearly a design oriented guide. It doesn't do a great job of exploring more fulsomely with examples, non-tangible prototypes. And maybe we should put those in brackets, and I take responsibility for this. You know, prototyping is good for products and services, but what about a new inclusive board governance model? Right? So how does one develop that? How do you assess it? I think a lot of the big things that we're dealing with in the world are not like technology or, you know, a new office setup or a new way to set up an employment insurance line where you're coming to get a new check and the service could be better. So I think non-tangible prototypes are their own circus, and they require their own evaluation approach. We do need to talk a little bit more about, beyond the merit of whatever idea is being tested through whatever form of prototype, there are other effects that emerge through the prototyping process. I have seen, and veteran social innovators have reinforced, that the purpose of prototyping, sometimes the prototyping itself doesn't even matter, the prototypes. The act of prototyping is a change process. It changes the people who go through it, the effect on the participants, and it is actually like a Trojan horse, sneaky way to disrupt systems in a gentle way and get them ready for even bigger pushes, or to sneak ideas into systems. New insights, relationships, power dynamics, and narratives. These two things alone, I know that we've done them in the lab at different times, but we could be even more explicit about how to capture those effects. This guide is primarily focused on the merit of an idea, and it doesn't touch on these two things that are quite important. And finally, it doesn't talk, the guide and the field requires us to talk a little bit about evaluating the process of social innovation prototyping, including how it contributes to a broader strategy or a portfolio of responses. We talk a little bit about that as one of the principles, but understanding that is another kind of evaluation question that's important for social change. And it doesn't really talk about how well we're actually doing the social innovation process itself, including the prototyping process. Now, Geraldine, you'll notice that I put and more up there. I literally could do more, but practically I didn't know how to fit any more circles onto this diagram. So But I really, maybe the end point of this is that I think it's a good, solid contribution as an expression of being more intentional and systematic about one part of it. But there's a lot more to do, and I think we're a better field if we do this in 3 years. All of these bubbles are dark blue because someone's working on them, and we have a much more richer constellation of people trying to be more intentional and systematic about evaluating prototypes. So this is where I think we are with this product.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's great. Thank you for all of those insights. It reminded me a little bit, one thing I learned about Frances in the process of working with her was her, she started really in the theatre too, as a director. And so maybe some of that emergent, the emergent elements of that process maybe informs part of her thinking on this in this realm as well. Of course, she went then into business sort of development too. So, you know, she's multifaceted. I don't want to assume anything, but yeah, that's what came to mind as I was thinking about what you said in regards to the two types. And I know that we all have natural proclivities in both directions. And what's so awesome really about so many of these social innovation processes, when done well, is that they invite all of those perspectives and all of those skills and talents to the table. So if you're not design inclined necessarily, they can be helpful in other ways. So okay, I want to not do all the talking at all here either. So I'm just going to bring into the conversation Ben and Aaliyah, for those that missed the introduction to the call. Ben Weinlich is the Executive Director of Skills Society and founder of Think Jar Collective and Action Lab. And Aaliyah Velji is the Senior Specialist Innovation and Research at the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Thank you both again for being here. And thanks again, Mark, for kicking us off here. I just want to encourage, before we go into more general discussion, if you have questions, anybody who's listening in, or any reflections that you'd like to add, please use the chat feature and we'll get to them as we can in the second half of this this webinar today. So Aaliyah, I might turn to you first. I know you know you have worked with both of these gentlemen at different times too, and have done a ton of prototyping yourself in your own work. Given your experience with prototyping over the years, how well do these sorts of methods and principles fit with the ways that you've experienced the process of prototyping itself? Is there anything that you wanted to highlight in particular, or anything that you wanted to say, what about this, when it comes to evaluating prototypes?
If I put my CMHC hat on, the biggest thing from these large institutions that are funding these processes is impact, right? So we sometimes lose sight of the fact that a prototype is a little mini test to see the desirability and viability, and we move it right into what is the impact going to be, because our systems are created, so like our systems are designed so that we need to know the impact that the organization will create by funding this. So I've watched from like a CMHC point of view, our organization shift from taking small bets, doing research into cool areas where we could prototype different housing solutions, towards this place of scaling is the most important thing. We're in a housing crisis. We gotta show value for what we're doing. And in that process, we've redesigned how we engage in the prototyping process and in labs in general to ensure that the prototypes can get scale. And one of the biggest shifts I've seen there is this concept of partnering with groups that might be able to take that prototype and scale it into the ecosystem. So we've worked a lot actually with CSI on this type of stuff, and it takes a very, very long time. So the other challenge is now we have to tell stories about the impact that these long-term processes have created within the bounds of a a traditional measurement system. So I think this is a challenge with prototyping if we see it simply as a probe or a bet in the system, because we're not like we're not VC, like we don't have that flexibility of a VC, like a venture capitalist. We are placing government dollars into certain like into certain organizations to help us figure out the housing problem. So the risk profile on how we do this, I think, is changing as the crisis in the specific topic area of housing gets more and more complex. So that's one thing I've noticed in my kind of CMHC world. But then if I go back to my work with Ben and Mark on the Shift Lab, it was a time in this space where we could actually take a lot of bets. And the same pattern happened with time. It took us sort of 5 years to see those prototypes become kind of, some of them are social enterprises and some of them have really long-term impacts. And so it's like this time over impact piece that I always have to negotiate with in kind of giving life to prototypes.
Yeah, I'd love to talk a bit more about the tension there. Mark, when you introduced it, you're saying, these are prototypes. These are not the thing. Like, this is not what you scale. You're testing something out, to work out whether or not you should move to the next stage. But we're working on a housing lab now. There's a great deal of expectation that you're going to be moving to something that will scale and have impact. The crisis is real. People are homeless, like it's all these things. So there's a great deal of pressure to move these things forward. Any insights from Mark or Ben on this score, just in relation to how do you both protect the space, but also be realistic about moving forward through that sort of challenge?
You want me to go, Mark? Yeah, no, nice to be with everybody.
I thought but Ben,
yeah, we're getting some lag here, Mark.
Mark, you might have to maybe jump off and jump back on. Your connection is freezing. Ben, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, yeah, okay. So, I mean, there's also lots of real experts on this call too that have kind of explored with a lot of this. So it's great to kind of see all the folks and all the experience around this. I think for me, I'm going to go back to like 20 some years ago. I kind of came from Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the disability rights stuff in that space. And you did change making by grassroots community development, working with different communities. You took it to the streets and those kinds of things. I think when I first started to get into the prototyping stuff, what I found promising about it wasn't just talking about ideas, but making something tangible, which helped you to see your assumptions better, test your assumptions better. And there was something that I think is still valuable to look at that's better than just talking about ideas. So I think first off, that there's value in that is still promising today, although there's a lot of these questions in terms of the expectations and the hopes that people put on prototyping. One of the things I've really learned from Mark a lot that I love is he's really clear on, like, I think when we get into social innovation space, we want to find silver bullets. We want to find simple things that are going to fix everything, because there's a lot going on in our world. We need solutions quick, and we have our brains that when we're in uncertainty and when we're overwhelmed, we tend to fall for oversimplified solutions. It's a thing that we all can fall for. So one of the things I like that Mark does is he's really clear on, here's what this can do and here's what it can't do, right? And we're not trying to be everything to everything, right? Because that's not going to work. I also think, you know, one of the reasons we do prototyping, there's this great pie chart. I wish I could show it to you. I don't have it here right now, but great pie chart where you have like a tiny sliver of the pie that's like, you know, it's this thing that says shit you know about an issue. There's a little one of like shit you know you don't know. And then the big part of the pie is shit you don't know you don't know. And that's why we do prototyping, to get those reactions, to test those things with different folks, and you learn from that. And so there is a kind of participatory action research thing Mark was talking about, where you're the active inquiry, the active kind of testing and probing, you get learning throughout a system, and that can be super valuable. That can be really deep for shifting systems over time. We've gotten better over the years, I think, because I feel this practical urge too, that I don't want to just have prototypes. It's this tension that are only kind of bets of possibilities, but, you know, figuring out ways to find something that we're going to implement or support implementation around it that turns into pilots. And the way we've gotten better at that is really good scoping of a challenge beforehand. I think a lot of social innovation work, if you don't scope a challenge decently, you don't get as much impact or as much potential for implementation down the line. And I think we saw that from Aaliyah and I and Mark and other colleagues that are on this call, working on Shift Lab 1.0 to 2.0. We spent 9 months in a scoping phase to come up with 4 questions, and there are scaling pilots and whole new organizations that have developed out of that because of the good scoping. So there's a promising signal around scoping properly that's really important. So those are a couple things, and I think there's also a thing, I mean, we could talk about later, the 3 Horizons framework that we've adapted that I think is really valuable for some of this change making piece, but I'll leave it for now on that. Mark's back without the, yep.
Without the lagginess.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Did you want to jump in too and just responding to Aaliyah's point and anything Ben just offered as well?
Yeah, I will respond and add, and I think I'm aligned with Ben's thinking on this. So Leah, thank you for pointing that out. I think you surfaced another challenge in using the prototype guide and doing social innovation in general. In order for us to best understand the role of prototyping and how to evaluate it, we need to zoom out first on the social change process, and to say this does take time of developing and testing ideas. And in fact, you don't necessarily want to go too quickly or have every prototype lead to something that goes to the market. In fact, I think that's not a design problem, it's an expectation problem. Our job is to frame what winning is in social innovation change, and people are anxious and manic, and they want something immediate, and we have to acknowledge that and saying, I know you want that, but here's the arc of social innovation, and then let's zoom in and talk about the role of prototyping in that process. We want to get to impact, but this is a step towards impact. I'm going to just confirm this book. I heard it from Alex and some others. If you haven't seen The Slow Lane, have some of you seen this? I see you nodding, Geraldine. This is a very good book. Slow lane processes decouple speed from scale. Fast lane processes strip away complexity in favor of focus, circumventing what someone calls the human mess of conflicting desires and emotions to instead deliverable, measurable outputs. Move fast and break things is now the discredited mantra of Silicon Valley. Indeed, the definition of disruption is a sharp break in the status quo. Slow lane change is no less wedded to scale. Social change makers seek to change entire systems. However, people learn the hard way that speed can be the enemy of scale. Fast solutions awfully simply don't stick. And so our literacy about the change process, sometimes they do. Of course, there's lots of examples where fast changes do stick and we need fast change, but how do we manage expectations in an innovation process, and then to manage up to protect prototyping for what it's meant to be, which is to develop small tests before big tests, and knowing that they may not generate an impact, but they're supposed to give us some insight about what impact might be possible and whether it's a big bet. So Aaliyah, you're a veteran, you know this because I've seen Aaliyah work. You do what Ben is saying. You not only manage expectations about what is appropriate, you also give people some versions of quick wins. right? To give them something tangible and real, but knowing that they're often incremental or they may not stick, while you can currently create as much elbow room and protect as much time to work on something transformational. You do need a portfolio of quick wins and some longer reform-oriented transformational things. So, but Aaliyah, I think that's another example of what users of this guide should do. Reframe what is appropriate to expect in prototyping and give us the broader arc of social innovation and change, so we don't ask prototyping to do things that it cannot do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Did you want to respond to that, Aaliyah? Or you?
I think you had one bullet on your slide about the portfolio approach. And I think within that, we have to sort of say, these are our quick wins. This is what we're winning in for this reason. And this is the value it creates. And then these are the long-term pieces that may take a little bit longer. And I think that's what Ben was referring to as the three horizon model. So I think systems are still struggling with that, though, because they want this urgency to move fast. And when the problem is thicker and heavier and deeper, there's even more urgency. So it's like training the systems to allow for this type of fluidity across the three levels can be seen in portfolio approaches. So if we have 66 labs that we're running and we evaluate them on different segments of that horizon, you'll have your quick wins, you'll see why you get those quick wins, and then you'll have the longer term ones that take much longer to figure out. And you can see that in the Shift Lab, right? Like we had our Theory U, we sucked at the beginning, but then like now 6 years later, we have scaling prototypes in the market as social enterprises. So another challenge is, how do you keep measuring it for that long?
That's true. Yeah.
Yes, and culturally, like the three of you have been working on these processes for some time now and have seen, there's some reference here around educating around the culture shift that's required. What have you seen like that's promising in that regard? Like, have you seen shifts? Much of this work has been traditionally funded by foundations that have a bit more flexible capital. Have you seen changes even within the CMHC, Aaliyah, in your time that you've been there? These are big institutions with, some that are asked to give sizable investments. Have you all seen shifts in the cultural receptivity to this kind of work over time?
Ben, go ahead.
I think so. I think, some of our colleagues at the Alberta CoLab, I think Roya and a few others are on this call, and Alex Ryan and Karen Perla that started that. I think they really got something in the water supply of the government of Alberta to understand prototyping these approaches, embracing that. So I think there's something in Alberta in particular where that's been helpful around it. I think honestly, like, we're doing the future of labs work to kind of help with evaluation on what's working and not working. And I think there's receptivity, but I also think there's some good skepticism that is needed because of the overpromising and the hope of the silver bullet solutions around it that need to be questioned, of what prototyping and what labs or whatever kind of systems change process you're working on, what those can actually do. So I think there is some receptivity, but also some good skepticism. And I think we just need to get clear. I kind of feel we've gotten a little less coherent because some of it, we can't just use design thinking anymore. We all recognize that. We need systems, design approaches, and more. In the Shift Lab with our colleague Jody, we wove in Indigenous epistemologies for kind of looking at systems change approaches. That has to be done really carefully. It's challenging. But I think people are not just kind of going with silver bullet things, and there's a lot of don't throw away design thinking. There's a lot of there's many elements to it. The prototyping is still valuable, but when we're trying to get to design thinking, really works at a people level, and if you're trying to do systems change, that's at a different level. And so you get deep insights from a few people, but you can't necessarily, from lived experience, you can't necessarily translate that to deep systems change level. And rookies in the space often mistake those two. They conflate the two, and that's a big problem. So I think there's a lot of incoherence in this space more and more in terms of systems change work and we need to get better at it. And this is what many of us are trying to do with kind of continue with conversations like this, the future of labs approach, all of these things, because it's tricky. There's still merit in it, because some are snapping back to these solutionism things where it's like, let's just do kind of incubator style, give us the solutions from community and let's run them through a process which is usually more kind of business oriented, and let's run it through that and then let's scale it out because it's something we can grab onto. So we need to be careful of that, because we're going to be not solving the right problems, and these processes help you to ensure you're actually getting clear or a bit clear on the root causes a little bit. That's what they're aiming at, right? So I think there's something to that is we need to get better at, and there's still value in these approaches. At least that's what I'm kind of thinking about. And like, how do we, with all the rapid polycrisis change that's happening, how do we get systems to say we still need to invest in prototyping because it's going to be slower? So like Mark's showing the slow lane thing, when it's like we need some rapid stuff soon. In the housing space, it's huge. In Alberta, it's a big thing. So how do we kind of do a both and approach around that, rather than just it's too quick, just ram in the solutions and let's hope it works. So that's a real tricky thing.
There's sorry, go on, Aaliyah.
Sorry, go ahead, Geraldine.
No, I'm just gonna introduce, there's a number of comments in the chat now around various aspects of things that have been said. So I don't want to change the conversation unnecessarily, but people touching on which you're all invited to contribute to, the differences between prototyping and pilots, like educating on the difference between the two, and also how Angela sort of asks here, prototyping, as Mark mentioned, we associate with products like the Dyson vacuum, mouse traps and so on. It's less clearly defined around problems that are complex. So how would a prototype be effective in complex and urgent social spaces? So wondering if you had any thoughts there. I know you've touched on some of those elements already, but maybe addressing, the difference between the prototype and the pilot too, and when it's a good time to move forward with something.
Maybe I'll just give a really quick example. For me, a high fidelity prototype is it's relatively functional and you can test it in sort of field conditions, like what's it feel like and look like. And a pilot is you are live and people are watching and expecting results. And it doesn't mean you're not learning and adapting. It's very still adaptive and improvisational, but you're meant to be, it's showtime, right? Geraldine, to your thing. I'll give you an example. We once did a simulation in a Western city of a collaborative granting process, which had community leaders identify priorities and funders come together to say, let's have a one intake form to figure out how to take these proposals in from the community. And then let's go through a collaborative granting process where we review the proposal. And then once we like a proposal, all the collaborative funders would then say, I can fund capital, but not people. I can fund people, I can fund for 2 years. And they would weave together their stuff. It was a social innovation of granting. And before they went live, we did a simulation around the room and we had 9 different stations of the entire process. We had butcher paper on the wall and we said, let's walk through this process. And someone, the expression of interest form on the webpage. And someone went, hey, this form is impossible. Who wrote this form? And someone else said, you did. And they went, oh, cripes, I did. Right. Well, it's not working. It's no good. And then we just wrote it on the paper. We went all around and we found out a lot. That was clearly a prototype that was semi-functional because we had community members and funders there. Then they launched about 6 months later, informed by this prototyping session, and they still found lots of problems and things that didn't work, but it was showtime. Money was going out the door. Things were being tracked. Real lives were being viewed. So that it's a blurry line, I think, but that's more of a design-oriented example. But that's the distinction between the two, and the possibility that we can do for prototypes things that are more tangible. They include processes and governance and different ways of relating with each other. So that's my response to that. Ali and Ben, you've got tons of examples.
I forgot the question.
Yeah, me too.
It's okay, because I think I'd like to go to another question, and thanks so much, Mark, because I think you answered that well. And we can, of course, we've got reams of examples. The three of you have a ton of experience. So I'm going to go to Christopher here, who's written, this may have been discussed, but he points out it's interesting to recognize the difference between quick wins versus total quality management. And he cites, sort of the origins of some of the theories behind quick wins, Cotter's change model, diffusion of innovation, and agile. And he's citing that he thinks we're getting closer to total quality management or small incremental change in this work rather than the agile. Any reflections on that?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were asking me. No, I wrote it all in there.
No, I was, thanks so much, Christopher. Sorry, I was going to ask for these guys to reflect on what you offered up there.
Chris is a super cool designer too at J5. Yeah.
Uh,
So I don't know the total quality thing, but I will say I do think I'm more cautious now on some of these methods that came more out of more simplified spaces, less complex spaces that came out of the business world. That, agile and even design thinking, these approaches. One, I remember cringing at myself some years ago around whole like fail fast thing. So fail fast to succeed sooner, that whole IDEO thing. Great if you're developing a product or something like that. Not good if you're developing intellectual disability services and you're going around, and this is the space that I work in mostly, and if you're going around saying, hey, we're gonna fail with experimenting with your services, that is not cool, right? To be playing around like that. And so we need to be, at the same time, we don't want to snap back to a kind of status quo, just doing what we're used to because we're afraid around it. So there needs to be some fearlessness to kind of explore and experiment. But some of those oversimplified principles in these spaces, we'd have to be careful of. So there's still some good things of prototypes, small bets, all of those things before big bets. Those are very, very valuable and important. I think there's we need to be careful in terms of the context that we're working in, and that we're working alongside people within a system, to be careful of some of those maxims and slogans and things that people use that do come from more of a STEM space or a product development space. And when in complexity, there's so many different pieces to this. It depends on perspectives, cultural backgrounds, biases. Like there's so many things to it, right? So I go back to, I learned this from Mark, Francis Wesley, and Brenda Zimmerman, the kind of and the Sinafin framework of the typology of problems: simple, complicated, complex, chaotic. And I think some of these we need to be careful. They maybe work for simple and complicated, but not for complex challenges.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Ben. I think that's terrific. I'm going to try and squeeze in maybe one more question here from the audience. And Christopher, I wish I could bring you in on the conversation. There's so many great people on this call, and it just makes me feel like we'll just need to do more of these together and share the wealth of knowledge that we have on this call with everybody and with each other. Any tips on how to manage long-term goals when there are short-term political cycles? Always a question of politics. I'm going to throw that in the mix. Anything that people want to speak to there, Mark, Ben, or Aaliyah?
Ali, it's a tough one, but you wrestle with it. You've done a lot of different labs. It's got to be a feature of all of them.
Yeah, so I think there was a question about like what's happening with this with these labs in big spaces. And I've seen labs like Ben mentioned, the CoLab. There was a lab called Studio 44 in an education ministry. Across the federal government, labs have emerged and died. And I think CMHC has the last one standing. And what happens is that talent about prototyping and generating systemic impact, it doesn't disappear. It just gets kind of embedded into the organization in different ways. So I think that thinking never gets lost, but the safe spaces where we can do this rapidly and in a sheltered way is being lost as funding cycles shift. So there's like, it takes a really strong individual to stay in these systems and watch those changes happen incrementally over time. And a lot of people doing this work get frustrated and leave. So it's like it takes a very strong type of individual to stay within these spaces and watch it over time, nurture it, and kind of you know, Mark, we always used to use the infinity loop. Now there's like the Berkana loop that has this like nurturing space. Like this is what needs to happen with certain individuals that can hold that space in these systems that change with political cycles, or else you're going to lose that mindset within the institutions that hold the funding that are affected by these political cycles. So there's like this other type of innovator now that needs to come up and sort of know this way of thinking and hold that space for it to sort of get to where it needs to go. And you have to be resilient to really do that.
Geraldine, I know we're caught for time, but thanks for finishing with that, Aaliyah. In order for social innovation processes, which include the tactic of social innovation prototyping, to work well, we have to zoom out and really understand the messy dynamics of change. Prototypes are not the driver of change. They're a tactic within a change process. And so when do you need the bridging that you're talking about, the hospice working, the tempered radicals on the inside? Like, I think we have to, that was your first comment, Ali. I think it's really good. I mean, you implied this. We have to zoom out to understand how we're going to make change, and then zoom in and going, let's spend a little bit of time with this tactic, but let's not get obsessed with the tactic. It's just a tactic.
Yep. 100%. Oh my God, so many things here and so little time to talk about them. I know that there's a gathering in May around the future of labs that some people will be getting together to look at how some of these processes have evolved over the last sort of 15 years plus. So I know there will be some products that come from there, some new thinking and new sort of reports and podcasts and whatnot that we'll be sharing with everybody, not just on this call, but more broadly as well. So I do want to flag that there'll be ongoing sort of knowledge products and ways of engaging in this work over the next several months. It's an area for Social Innovation Canada that's critical for us to understand better ourselves, but also to share with everybody else as well. So I know we're right at time, and I want to thank Mark. Thank you for your contributions through the guide, and Ben and Aaliyah, thank you also for joining us today. Andrea, thanks for welcoming us all in well at the head of this conversation, and thanks to everybody for all your questions and comments. Kathleen, who's working the back end here, thank you for holding us together in this way. Just to acknowledge the guide that we've been referencing throughout this webinar is Evaluating Social Innovation Prototypes. It's available on the Social Innovation Canada website at sicanada.org. And you can download it there, co-authored there by Mark Cabaj, president of Here to There Consulting. Ben is with Skills Society and also the founder of Think Jar Collective and Action Lab, and Aaliyah Valges with the CMHC, a senior specialist innovation and research. As Kathleen would want me to say, this session has been recorded and will be shared with everyone who registered in short order. If you've enjoyed this session and want more like it, remember to sign up for our monthly newsletter. We are currently designing a new event platform for you, and we're looking forward to sharing news of that with you all very soon. Have a wonderful rest of your Tuesdays, everyone, and thanks for being with us. Have a good day.
Thanks.